Hello everyone, my name is Gary O'Mealy, and in this video we are going to start wrapping up our discussion on the endocrine system by talking about some other miscellaneous hormones that didn't necessarily fit in the theme of some of our other videos. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into this. So we're going to start with the pineal gland, which is very small, very hard to locate. It's in the brain. It's located posterior to both the thalamus and hypothalamus, which we are anatomically familiar with based on our discussions about the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary from before. So the pineal gland I have highlighted here because, again, it's a little hard to find. So the pineal gland secretes a hormone that I'm sure you have heard of before called melatonin, and that is an amine hormone. So, as I said, you're probably familiar with melatonin as being kind of an over-the-counter nutritional supplement that helps you get to sleep at night, but actually it is a naturally produced hormone by the pineal gland that helps to regulate your circadian rhythms. So a circadian rhythm refers to any changes in your physical, mental, behavioral, or physiological state as you progress throughout the 24-hour day. And namely, what this is referring to is how you behave in response to your waking and sleeping cycle. So melatonin is responsible for producing your dark adapted behaviors. So what you tend to do when the sun is not shining and there is very little light available. So this is why you feel sleepy when it gets dark outside. It's why you don't generally get sleepy when it's light outside. So melatonin gets secreted by the pineal gland when the sun has gone down. And generally the way this works is that the pineal gland's production of melatonin is tied closely to the amount of light that is sensed by the retinas of the eyes. So melatonin production spikes when it is dark outside, and melatonin production is inhibited when it is light outside. Now, very often, workers who work odd shifts, so people who work during the dead of the night and then try to sleep during the day, their circadian rhythms tend to be a little bit disrupted. So for people like that, taking melatonin supplements might be a good thing to help them sleep when they are otherwise not producing melatonin because it's light outside. So here's a diagram of how this pathway works. So what I'm illustrating here is an eyeball with the optic nerve connecting to a part of the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. When we talked about the hypothalamus before, we talked about a couple of different types of nuclei, like the supraoptic nucleus and the paraventricular nucleus, which are responsible for the production of oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Well, this is another collection of neuron cell bodies in the hypothalamus, and these neurons are receiving signals directly from the optic nerve. So they are receiving information about the amount of light that is being light information that is being transmitted through that optic nerve. So the way this works is that when it is light outside, and I'm kind of illustrating this as a flashlight, although it's going to be more in terms of whether the sun is shining or not. When there is light detected, that is going to activate the light-sensing photoreceptors of the retina. That will cause action potentials to be sent through the optic nerve here towards the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus. And then these neurons will send pathways to the pineal gland, and if light is detected, the pineal gland cells will be inhibited and prevented from producing melatonin. So when you are awake, when there is light available, you should not be making melatonin, and that's why you should be able to stay awake. You really shouldn't be getting sleepy during the day. On the other hand, when it's dark and there is no light available, no action potentials should be going through the optic nerve, no signals should be received by the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and as such, this inhibition of the pineal gland is removed, and the pineal gland is allowed to start making melatonin, which helps make us sleepy when it is dark outside. Okay, so let's move on to gonadal hormones. So we are going to talk about the hormones of the reproductive system in chapter 27, and those videos are not too far away. So we'll talk about those in more detail in the future, but I did just want to quickly kind of go over a little bit of a case study here to really drive home how the negative feedback works, especially given that the production of testosterone in men and estrogen in females is going to be regulated in very much the same way as cortisol or thyroid hormone that we've looked at before. So the case study I want to go over here has to do with not necessarily just baseball, although baseball is certainly kind of the most famous example of this. So if you were growing up in the 90s like I was, in the summer of, I want to say it was 1997, the big story was the home run race, the race to see which professional baseball player was going to hit the most home runs. So to my recollection, there were 3 players in this race. Mark McGwire, who you can see pictured here, Barry Bonds, and Sammy Sosa. Okay, so these guys were all hitting a ridiculous number of home runs. They were all chasing the home run record of a guy named Roger Maris, who at one point had hit, I think, 62 home runs in a season. And in that summer, Mark McGwire broke the home run record, and then I think a year or 2 later, Barry Bonds broke that record. Well, the idea, what eventually came out, is that the reason these baseball players were hitting so many home runs is because they were abusing anabolic steroids. So anabolic steroids in the sports and professional baseball world are basically just synthetic testosterone. So these guys were basically injecting themselves with synthetic testosterone, and the idea of doing these injections is that they are introducing more testosterone into their systems than would ever naturally be found there. Okay? So what's the benefit of that? Well, the benefit of that in men is that testosterone helps to aid in the expansion and growth of skeletal muscle mass, which is obviously useful for hitting home runs. But, like I said, this is going to cause some downstream problems, right? So yes, it helps you hit a whole lot of home runs, but if there were no drawbacks, then everybody would be doing this. Everyone would want to bulk up and be very physically fit and very strong, okay? So like I said, in the late 90s and kind of early 2000s, a lot of baseball players were found to have abused these anabolic steroids to help boost their performances. So 2 of the most commonly understood drawbacks of frequent anabolic steroid abuse are, number 1, testicular atrophy. So we're talking about the shrinking of the testicles, right? So in a second, we're going to explain how that actually happens. And then also sterility. So for men, we're talking about the inability to produce viable functional sperm. So we can actually explain both of these phenomena by talking about the negative feedback that has to do with the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, negative feedback concepts that we have already explored for cortisol and the adrenal cortex, and then the thyroid hormone and the thyroid. Okay, so this feedback loop should be looking very, 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 very familiar at this point. So in order to get the testes to naturally produce testosterone, the hypothalamus needs to produce and secrete GnRH, gonadotropin-releasing hormone. That will stimulate the anterior pituitary, which will then produce both luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. Luteinizing hormone will stimulate the testes to produce free testosterone, and follicle-stimulating hormone will stimulate the testes to get the spermatogenesis process going, to produce new viable functional sperm. So, as I indicated before, an injection of synthetic testosterone will provide super physiological levels of testosterone. And what I mean by super physiological is that this is more testosterone than would ever naturally be produced by the body. So that's why I have 2 up green arrows here. That is to indicate a super physiological dose. Well, the downside of that is that all of that extra testosterone is going to feed back on the hypothalamus and feed back on the anterior pituitary and reduce the levels of GnRH and reduce the levels of LH and FSH. So if you want to rationalize this, someone who is regularly taking injections of free testosterone shouldn't really have any need to produce natural testosterone, so that's why the body stops producing luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone, because the body is sensing that, okay, there's already way too much testosterone here, we don't need to be producing any more. So repeated injections of testosterone are going to ensure that the testes are no longer stimulated with either luteinizing hormone or follicle-stimulating hormone, and this is going to lead to atrophy of the testes due to underexposure to luteinizing hormone, and then underexposure to follicle-stimulating hormone means that there's not really going to be any further sperm production. So there's your explanation for why those two things happen to men who abuse anabolic steroids. Okay, shifting gears here, this is a list from your textbook detailing some other non-classical hormones that are produced by non-classical glands. So again, classical glands, we're talking about tissues and organs that producing hormones is what you expect them to do, right? So the thyroid, the pancreas, the adrenals, things like that. So we've kind of gone through a couple of examples of these, like the heart is an endocrine gland. It produces a hormone called atrial natriuretic peptide that helps to regulate sodium levels in the blood. So again, the heart is not, like, producing hormones is not its primary responsibility, but it still does it, right? So it's a secondary function for the heart. So we could spend some time talking about a lot of these, and if you want some additional context on some of the ones that help to regulate calcium, like calcitriol from the kidneys, or cholecalciferol from the skin, which helps to produce vitamin D, that is all detailed in Chapter 6. As of the recording of this video in fall of 2024, we are not covering Chapter 6 this semester, but you may want to look at that in the future. But for now, I want us to focus on a couple that we're going to end up talking about in the future, namely renin, which comes from the kidneys, and erythropoietin, which also comes from the kidneys. So we will be talking about those in the future, so I thought we could go ahead and introduce them now. So erythropoietin is a hormone that helps to stimulate the production of new red blood cells. So new red blood cell production, which is called hematopoiesis, takes place in red bone marrow. So red bone marrow is a storehouse for hematopoietic stem cells, which can be induced chemically through hormonal stimulation to start dividing and differentiating and producing new red blood cells. So the way this works is the initial stimulus here is hypoxia, or low levels of systemic oxygen, okay? So the rationale here is that, okay, if we sense that there is not enough oxygen being transported in the body, well, let's make some new red blood cells. Since red blood cells carry oxygen around, that's the idea. That's the strategy here. Let's produce more carriers of oxygen so that we can get more oxygen carried around. The kidneys are going to act as the sensor and the control center here, so they have a way of detecting how much oxygen is in the blood. The kidneys will respond by producing erythropoietin, or EPO, which is a hormone that will travel through the blood. And our target here, the cells that actually have the EPO receptors, are going to be the hematopoietic stem cells of the red bone marrow. So they will be induced to start dividing and differentiating to produce new red blood cells. And with new red blood cells carrying more oxygen around, the hypoxia should go away and negative feedback should shut this down naturally, just like we have seen many times before. Okay, so next let's talk about renin and an associated molecule called angiotensinogen. So renin is a hormone, but more specifically it's an enzyme that is produced by the kidneys, and then angiotensinogen is a protein that is produced by the liver. These two proteins we are going to see will work together to stimulate the release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. So you hopefully remember aldosterone as being one of the steroid hormones that's released by the zona glomerulosa of the adrenal cortex. So we had mentioned back in our video on the adrenal glands that aldosterone release is not really sensitive to ACTH like cortisol is, and its production and its regulation is a little bit more complicated. So we're going to kind of lay the groundwork for understanding how that works here. So renin is an enzymatic protease hormone. So a protease is an enzyme that cuts peptide bonds. So it cuts up proteins into little bitty pieces. Okay? So renin is an enzymatic protease hormone that cleaves angiotensinogen in the blood to produce a more active protein called angiotensin 1. A free little piece of advice as you move ahead in your career, whether you go to nursing school or medical school or whatever, this little prefix up here, inogen, anytime you see that, it means that is an inactive protein. It means it's not doing anything yet. So by removing some of the amino acids from angiotensinogen, we remove the part that's keeping it inactive and we allow it to become the active form, which is called angiotensin 1. Now, angiotensin 1 is not fully active, but it is more active than angiotensinogen was. So angiotensin 1 is going to circulate throughout the bloodstream, and eventually it's going to get to the capillaries in the lungs, where it is going to be cleaved again by another protease enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE. So this will cleave angiotensin 1. It's going to cut off a couple of more amino acids and turn it into the fully active angiotensin 2. Now, if this acronym ACE here seems familiar, that's because it probably should. If you've ever heard of a drug called an ACE inhibitor, this is the enzyme that drug is inhibiting. So when we get to chapter 19 and chapter 20, we will start learning how ACE inhibitors work as a means of regulating a person's blood pressure. So angiotensin 2 is going to act in two different manners, both in parallel with each other. Angiotensin 2 can increase arterial vasoconstriction as a means of increasing blood pressure, and angiotensin 2 can also stimulate the cells of the zona glomerulosa to release aldosterone. So here you can see an illustration from your book in terms of how all of this works. So again, renin is secreted by the kidneys. That cleaves angiotensin into angiotensin 1. In the lungs, angiotensin 1 is cleaved into angiotensin 2 by ACE. And then angiotensin 2 will stimulate widespread vasoconstriction to increase blood pressure and also stimulate the adrenal cortex to stimulate aldosterone. Anything beyond that, we are going to wait until we get to chapter 25 because we really need to understand how reabsorption and secretion activities work in the nephrons of the kidneys to really understand what it is that aldosterone does. But that is kind of a primer to some of the hormonal mechanisms that are at play here. So you can look forward to hearing more about this at the end of the semester when we get to chapter 25. Okay, that's going to wrap it up for this video. Here is a list of vocabulary terms you probably ought to be aware of. And for checking your understanding, number 1, what determines whether melatonin is released from the pineal gland or not? Number 2, what is the stimulus for new red blood cell production? And number 3, what are the necessary components for aldosterone release from the adrenal glands? All right, that's going to do it for this video. If you have any questions, go ahead and drop them in the comments section. Otherwise, I will see you for the next video. So long.